All that up. I'm Bill Scholl. I'm the social justice consultant for the Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas, and on behalf of the Church of Northeast Kansas and Archbishop Naumann, I want to welcome you all to Savior Pastoral Center, which is also where our chancery is, and the chancery is where the Archbishop has his office. And I'm very pleased that the church has been able to sponsor this event and be a part of this discussion. Recently, I was blessed to be able to go to Toronto, Canada last week and participate in the World Parliament of Religions. And so they had 10,000 delegates from all over the world representing all the world's religions. And what was amazing to me, one of the great things I learned, is that every religious tradition has some version of the golden rule: to do or to not do unto others as you would do or not have done unto you. And it reminded me just how much we have so much more in common than we differ. And that's part of being human, right? Being human, we're called to not only love ourselves and love our families, but care for our communities and care for other people in our lives. And as the Director of Social Justice, I'm responsible for helping to catechize our Catholics and to spread the good news of the gospel. And I always tell people there's two ways to love, right? The first way to love is mercy, where you help the person in need. But the next way in which we're called to love is justice, in which we look at how do we address the needs in the first place, right? What are causing all these people to suffer, and how can we organize to stop that suffering? And so I'm so glad that the Office for Social Justice could help sponsor this event. And so I'd just like to welcome all of you. Particularly, I want to thank some of the American Public Square staff and all the great work you do. Jeff Fendorf, Monty Holman, Ashley Beard-Fosnow, and also I'd like to recognize, do we have any public servants in the audience? But just by a show of hand, if you're a public servant, if you're an elected official or you serve the public in some way, would you just raise your hand? Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight and being a part of this very important discussion. Now, at this event, at this point, I'd like to also thank Elana Mueller for all the great work you've done, and I'd like to just turn the podium over to you. Thank you, Elana.
Well, good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good, excellent. Bill, thank you so much. Thank you for having us tonight. As Bill said, my name is Elana Mueller, and I'm the Director of Community Development for American Public Square. I want to welcome everybody, not just here in the room, but we're also live streaming tonight. So welcome if you're on the interwebs. Great to have you as well. Tonight's program, The Criminalization of Policy, is the third in a series of 4 programs that American Public Square is hosting in conjunction with its KC Common Good initiative. KC Common Good is an alliance that has emerged from a year-long effort to convene the people and organizations that seek to reduce violence in Kansas City. For more than 4 years, American Public Square has been bringing people together in Kansas City to talk about controversial issues, and KC Common Good is simply an extension of that work. This time, we're seeking solutions to a particular problem right here in our metro area. KC Common Good's mission is to provide hope and access to opportunity to all members of our Kansas City metropolitan area by uniting people and organizations who work to reduce violence, create safe and affordable housing, and ensure quality education, healthcare, job training, and placement for everyone. And in line with tonight's theme and the mission of KC Common Good, today is also known as World Kindness Day. How many of you knew that? A few of you? Excellent. Very good. I'm delighted to know that as well. World Kindness Day, as you may know, is a movement that encourages all people to focus on being a little kinder to one another. And under the leadership of Mayor Peggy Dunn of Leawood, Kansas, several area cities on both sides of the state line have adopted proclamations recognizing World Kindness Day in conjunction with KC Common Good. I want to specifically thank Mayor Dunn in the city of Leawood. I also want to thank Mayor Laura Wasmer of Prairie Village, Kansas, Mayor and CEO David Albee of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas, Mayor Paula Schwach of Westwood Hills, Kansas, Mayor Sly James of Kansas City, Missouri, Mayor Carson Ross of Blue Springs. Can we give them all a hand? I think that's right. Thank you. If you want more information about World Kindness Day and the proclamations, there's a sample proclamation inside your playbill that sort of describes what the proclamations look like. I also have 5 of the 6 proclamations on display in the back of the room. I hope that before you leave this evening, you'll stop by and take a look. Also, you may be wondering what's going on up here in the front of the room. You'll also notice that we have 2 really gorgeous posters in the back. Renee Andriani, our local artist, is graphically recording tonight's event, as she has for the last 2 KC Common Good events. They're really amazing, and they truly capture the essence of the conversations that take place, so be sure to stop back there and take a look. I want to also recognize tonight's sponsors. American Public Square's presenting sponsors for its season include Sue Seidler and Louis Norman, the Hall Family Foundation, Z-Trip, the Abernathy Charitable Trust, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, and the H&R Block Foundation. The specific sponsors for tonight's program include Peggy and Terry Dunn, the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, and the Dunn Family Foundation. We also have 2 specific supporters, Faith Always Wins Foundation and Sandy and Ed Freed. Tonight's partners also include the National Archives of Kansas City and the Office for Social Justice of the Archdiocese of Kansas City and Kansas. Let's give them all a round of applause. As you may know, American Public Square is a member-supported organization. How many of you are members of American Public Square? Excellent. Thank you so much for your membership. We really, truly could not do this without you. If you're not a member, in your playbill, there is, I know you're surprised to hear this, there's information about how you can join. You could even join us right here tonight. We'll have information available following the program. Also, if you did not register for tonight's program or you were registered as a guest, you can register now by visiting AmericanPublicSquare.org. By registering and providing us with your email address, what you'll allow us to do is to send you a survey from tonight's program. It will also enable us to send you information about future events, and we hope that we'll see you at more events in the future. Also in your playbill, you'll find information about each of tonight's panelists. You'll also find some great facts about tonight's topic, as well as a link to more facts and information on this topic. We're able to provide these fact sheets and sources of information due to a generous grant that we received from the William T. Kemper Foundation, so please be sure to check that out. In fact, one person who I visited with earlier tonight said that before he came, he studied up, so I'm glad to know the fact sheets are being put to use. Inside your playbill, you'll also find a question and fact sheet. So on one side is a question, on the other side a fact sheet. It looks exactly like this. If you have a question or a fact check, please write it down and hold it up. There's no need to wait until a break. Simply hold it up and a volunteer will come by to collect it as soon as you have it ready. In fact, Classy Alcine, where's Classy? Classy wave, there's Classy. Classy is tonight's roving reporter. She'll be gathering all of the questions and asking them on our behalf to the panelists. Additionally, you'll see over here we have Tom Burns and Chris LeBeau, our fact checkers for this evening. We also have civility bells in tonight's audience. Who has a civility bell? Will you ring one? Oh. You have to have that ready. There it is. There it is. Thank you, Alicia. The bell will ring if the tone of the conversation becomes less than civil, so panelists be forewarned. We also ask that you not clap during the panel discussion. Not only does this save time, but allows us to maintain our air of civility that we all cherish so much. It is now my pleasure not only to take my seat and to allow the program to begin, but more particularly to introduce tonight's moderator, Debbie Bayless. Debbie has been a mediator with the Center for Conflict Resolution, or CCR, since 2004, and mediation coordinator since August of 2009. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and human services with a minor in German language and psychology. Currently, Debbie works primarily in neighborhoods and various court diversion programs. She is thoroughly enjoying her work on a master's degree in restorative justice at Eastern Mennonite University. Please join me in welcoming Debbie Bayless.
Thank you. Tonight's program is called The Criminalization of Policy. You may also have heard that this called the criminalization of poverty. We are going to have a conversation about how our public policies and laws at the local, state, and national levels disproportionately affect the poor, particularly poor communities of color. This may be unintentional, it may not be. Our panel tonight has a wide range of experience in policy and in a variety of roles in the criminal justice system. On my left is Lavanya Madhusudan. She has worked for over a decade at the intersection of grassroots community organizing, advocacy, and research, conducting thorough analysis of many of the most urgent social and health challenges facing society today. She currently works to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice for people of color in Seattle. Lavanya earned an MPA from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and MSW from the University of Maryland. Next is Wayne Smith. He's a managing attorney for Legal Aid of Western Missouri. He manages a team of attorneys representing very low-income criminal defendants in the municipal courts of Kansas City, Missouri. This team handles approximately 10,000 cases a year, providing representation when a city is seeking jail time and to everyone in custody. Wayne was in private practice for 25 years, handling civil litigation on the defense side. He received his JD from University of Kansas Law School. Next is Delilah Otto. She's a circuit court judge, Jackson County, Missouri. She was appointed as circuit judge in October 2017, having served as an associate circuit judge in Jackson County from 2014 to 2017. Prior to her appointment to the bench, she served as a chief trial assistant for the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office, as well as a special assistant United States attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Delilah received her law degree from the University of Missouri Columbia School of Law. Jean Peters Baker is the prosecutor for Jackson County, Missouri. She was appointed prosecutor in 2011 and elected to the position in 2012. She was first hired as a young assistant prosecutor by Claire McCaskill. Over her career in the prosecutor's office, Jean has served in sex crimes and child abuse, community justice, domestic violence, drug enforcement, family support, major crime, and as chief warrant officer. She received her MPA and JD degrees from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Let's welcome them. We'll start with Lavanya with a question. You are the author of a report commissioned by the Job Opportunities Task Force and funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, published earlier this year. This report looked at the extent to which the criminalization of poverty is occurring in Maryland. Can you first define for us the term criminalization of poverty?
Sure, thank you so much, Debbie. So I'd like to first start off by saying that there's no universally accepted definition. It's a fairly new area of research and learning, but there's kind of two aspects to it. The first is that we're talking about policies, laws, and practices that result in consequences for low-income people, often penalties that are unnecessary in many cases without any benefit for these individuals. And the second component is situations where low-income people are arrested or detained simply because they are poor and cannot afford to comply with various legal financial obligations, even something as simple as paying a traffic ticket or a parking ticket. And so these are the two components of the definition that I'd like to share, and also taking into account the broader racial history of our country. We're really talking about people of color as primarily being affected when we talk about the criminalization of poverty, and primarily African American and Latino communities.
Thanks. What are the major themes of the findings from your study?
All right, well, it's a 94-page report, so it's a tad difficult to summarize, but basically we see that there are multiple pathways through which people of color and low-income people are interacting with the criminal justice system at higher rates, disproportionately higher rates when we look at the actual percentage of those groups within the broader population. And once they are interacting with the criminal justice system, we see that the consequences of those interactions, the rates of conviction, the length of detainment, pretrial as well as incarceration, and the severity of sentencing is higher, disproportionately higher for communities of color and low-income people. And as a result of this acquisition of a criminal record, which begins simply with being arrested, regardless of whether a person is eventually convicted or not, just the act of having an arrest record itself results in many collateral consequences, and that's a term which I'm hoping we can get into a little bit later. But basically, there are a series of barriers that are accrued after that initial interaction with the criminal justice system occurs that prevent people from being able to regain their status as a full participating and contributing citizen to society.
Thank you. Wayne, you and your team represent the very poor. Can you set the scene for us? What types of clients are you representing, and in what types of cases?
Well, our clients are appointed to us by the court, so essentially they have to qualify by the federal poverty guidelines. So whatever the federal poverty guidelines are, we automatically represent them. From a day-to-day standard, what happens is the judge basically is required to ask the defendant fill out an application, and if they, based upon their income, then we would represent them based on the federal poverty guidelines. Now, there's a set of clients that we automatically represent who are in custody, who are picked up and for whatever reason they're not able to post bond, or that they've missed court before and the bond is too high for them to make. So we represent all clients that are in custody. All of our clients are appointed to us because of a jailable offense. So our court is unusual in that we have a contract with the city where we are required, and the city does have our services to provide to defendants. Oh, sure. Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Sorry. I got a different mic than everybody else here. So basically, we are appointed by the court to represent people who fit within the federal poverty guidelines. And our court is unusual because we are court appointed. However, under contract, we're required to be at court, and we represent approximately 10,000 to 11,000 people a year. Essentially, 100% of our clients are poor. So in addition to people who are off the street and apply by application, we also represent defendants who are in custody, who for whatever reason cannot post bond. And so we are automatically appointed to those particular defendants, and we represent them on their cases in the particular municipal courts and based upon their charge.
Could you give us some examples of what types of cases you get?
Sure. Well, we represent, for example, we have domestic violence court in our court, and so we represent all defendants who are accused of domestic violence, child abuse, destruction of property, theft, all kinds of series of theft cases. We even do some animal abuse cases. We also represent traffic matters, the standard driving under the influence of alcohol, driving under the influence of drugs, also cases involving driving while suspended, and if there's any companion tickets. For example, if someone is speeding and then they get caught speeding and they happen to have no insurance but are driving while suspended, which is a jailable offense, we represent those particular defendants also. So it's, in addition to just traffic, it's more of traffic offenses that require jail time. There is one exception to our rule about jailable offenses, is marijuana. In the city, they decriminalized marijuana to making it a fine only. However, because it's only limited to the city, the court has appointed us, and we've agreed to represent defendants for charges of marijuana in the sense that there could be some repercussions in other jurisdictions. So in order to provide a defense to someone with marijuana, even though it's not a jailable offense, we will represent them to at least explain the consequences of a guilty plea for a marijuana case in the city, which is only a fine. However, it could be cumulative if they happen to be in Platte County or Clay County or in Kansas, for example.
Right, thank you. Do you see any of the themes that Lavanya talked about reflected in the cases and the defendants you deal with?
Sure, there's going to be some differences occasionally because our clients are poverty, so they can't afford a lawyer, they can't afford bond, they're not going to be able to pay fines or maybe probation fees. So our clients, a lot of times as our attorneys, we request that those fees be waived because of the fact that someone can't post bond. Most likely they're not going to be able to pay an excessive fine. So there's consequences like that, or our clients can do community service based upon our request to the judge to do community service rather than pay a fine. So there's a difference there. There's also a difference in sometimes our clients will end up taking a probation while a private citizen who may be able to pay a higher fine, for example, might be able to get out of probation and get an amendment to a particular charge, which is something different that most of our clients would not be able to do because they couldn't pay the fine.
Right, thank you. My next question was similar to that, but do you have anything more to add to, does the municipal court have something in their system that takes into consideration the lack of resources that your clients have? So that would be the community service
Correct,
and such?
right,
Yeah.
correct, they do that. And they'll waive fines and court costs because they understand, the courts understand that our clients cannot pay these fines, and so they're basically not wanting to set them up for failure. They don't want to send a defendant out and say, you owe a $750 fine, you have to pay it within a few months, knowing that chances are they may not, so they'll be back in court again. And so to prevent something from like that happening, they give them the option of our requesting of community service.
Okay, thank you. All right. Jalila,
You got it right. Yeah.
I did, I know.
It's a tough one, I know.
I know. Sorry for
That's
not
okay.
doing it right before.
That's okay.
You have been a prosecutor as well as a judge. Do you think the criminal justice system has a disparate impact on the poor?
I think that studies have shown that when you look at, am I loud? Is that better? Okay. Okay, it keeps going down. All right, I'll just lean forward. All right, studies have shown, I mean, this is, I'm sure you found this in your work as well, that yes, economic status does have an impact on outcomes in the criminal justice system. I don't think that's a shock to any of us. As a prosecutor, I can say that I've seen that as a prosecutor, as a federal prosecutor. I can say I saw that to a lesser scale, which we can talk about as we go through.
Is that better?
Okay, yeah, sure. Is that better? Can you guys hear me better? Okay. As I was saying, I saw it as a prosecutor. As a federal prosecutor, I saw it to a lesser extent, which we can talk about as we kind of go through this conversation tonight. When you mention policies and practices, there's probably a reason why you don't see it as much on the federal scale as you do on the state scale. And as a judge, I see it as well. I mean, you talk about the simplest of cases. It could be a traffic offense, and if someone can't pay the fines to get their car out of impound, that's going to have a disparate effect on people. They can't get to work, they may lose their job, or they can't pick their children up on time. There's a kind of think of the snowball effect, something so small that you or I may be fortunate enough to handle with a phone call or writing a check. Some people, it definitely has an impact on their entire livelihood. So a simple traffic ticket is not a simple affair for many members of our society. Further, you have other cases such as stealing and theft cases, and I know there's a lot of talk of years back about restorative justice and restitution. And I think you have to look at restitution in certain cases and the criminalization of restitution versus civil penalties in certain cases. I think these are various things that I know courts are looking at across at least the state of Missouri, if not the country, various diversion programs that take into account people that may or may not be able to pay fines within 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or paying restitution within a certain amount of time. I think that the courts are realizing that the traditional method of incarceration or whatever requirement I'm having you make, there's more options than those two. There's a lot of gray area between the two, and so I hope our conversation talks about that gray area between incarceration and doing nothing.
Do you see many differences between the circuit court and the municipal court regarding these?
So I don't do a tremendous amount of work in the Municipal Court of Kansas City. The way I always try and explain the court system is there's 3 branches of government and there's 3 levels of government. And so the 3 levels are local, state, and federal. And the municipal court is a local entity run by the city of Kansas City or whatever municipality that you may live in. And then there's the state government, and that's where I sit as a judge in the state courts and handle those kinds of cases. And then the federal is our 3rd level of government, which is where I was prosecutor at. So with regard to municipal cases, the only cases I personally dealt with, and Wayne has been in front of me before, are municipal appeal cases. So when someone is convicted in the municipal court, they have the right to appeal to the state court judge. And so I handled those types of cases. In I think it was 2015. I think we spent a lot of time together in 2015 dealing with those cases.
Yes.
And then on the state side, and I forgot your question. I want to go through that.
Just the differences between what do you see that's comparable to municipal court and circuit court?
Well, I think the conversation has to look at sentencing and the implications of sentencing. There are certain offenses. I know we may talk a little bit about marijuana offenses here tonight, whether it can be criminalized in the city versus the state, and the punishments are just higher for the exact same conduct. You talk about driving with revoked licenses. You can have the offense in the city, municipal court, as well as the state, and you're talking about a higher sentence. So I think that when you, again, talk about policies and practices and whether a case is going to be filtered through the municipal court versus the state court, you're talking about sentences that will be multiple times higher simply by making the choice to send them to the state side.
And I'm guessing the same would be with the federal.
Oh, yeah, now you're talking about, it kind of goes up exponentially when you go to the federal side. And when you talk about practices, I think you have to, and I hope Ms. Baker will touch upon, discretion of prosecutors is sometimes they decide whether cases go municipal, state, or federal. And when those types of decisions are made, and individuals' potential incarceration rates can go up exponentially. And we can talk about how those decisions are made and who that tends to impact the most.
Would you say that the system, there's some things that it's taking into consideration and doing right regarding those in poverty?
I think having conversations are a step in the right direction. We're lucky here in Missouri, our Supreme Court back in 2015 commissioned, it's called the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Fairness. And what it did is it got a bunch of judges and lawyers and practitioners, people on local government, state government, law enforcement in a room and started looking at criminal issues, civil issues, and how that impacts communities, just people's perception of the judicial system in general. We talk about judges and how they should be trained. And so I think just having that dialogue is vastly important. One of the things that we're working on right now in that commission is we're looking at pretrial release. We're looking at bail and bond reform. I think that is going to be something that is going to be ripe for discussion for the next 5 to 10 years. There are states out there that have outlawed bail bondsmen for 30, 40 years. They don't have bail bondsmen. And so when you start talking about, as Wayne said, can people bond out on cases, certain states don't even have that as an option. There are other factors they look at as, are you a danger to community? Will you return to court? And those are some of the things that we're starting to look at. Is that what we want to do? Oh, there you go. Is that what we want to do in Missouri, is go more toward a pretrial system rather than a bail and bond system based on your financial status?
Thank you.
You're okay. That's better. Is that better? Okay.
Right. And now we're done with you for now. I'm sure we'll come right back to you. We're ready. All right, Jean. Has America become over-criminalized?
Yes.
Could you say a little
Yes.
bit more about that?
All right. You want a little more than yes. I think the criminal justice system has been the sometimes the easiest place, sometimes the only place where societal ills can be dealt with. So, for instance, police officers receive a 911 call to go to a residence because someone has a mental illness and they are going through a psychotic episode. And so maybe often it's family that calls themselves. And so what are police to do? They respond to that call. They try to assess the situation, and they really have one choice now, don't they? If they arrest this person for being disruptive, do they take them to the local mental health facility where the officers can check them in and they are cared for with those who are trained to deal with mental health? No, they don't do that because that place doesn't exist. It's called jail. That's where they take them. That's what America has left as the option. So yes, in fact, yes. And that's just one example of many where the criminal justice system has been maybe a little bit vilified now, but has been the choice all of us have made that this is where we want to deal with this problem.
Yeah, final place for people to go. Yeah. What do you see as the role of the criminal justice system, especially in relation to those in poverty and such?
So I want to be careful that we don't just look at one side of this equation. And I think those of us who deal with this kind of issue on a regular basis, that study it, that really try and learn what's the next frontier for the criminal justice system, we have to be careful that we do not leave out victims. Victims are a real component of this system, and they must not be left out in the academic focus on what we do next and where do we go next, because they're real. So victims deserve a system that is fair to them as well, fair to the criminal defendant, but also fair to victims. And I think there's a new frontier for all of us, for victims, to have a greater voice inside a courtroom and a greater voice within the respective criminal justice system. That doesn't mean they are leading the charge, but it does mean that they have more protected rights, and I think that we'll see that as we go forward. But the criminal justice system should be about justice. And justice is a great big word, and depending on the speaker of that word, we may think we know what that means. Justice can be a variety of different things. Justice can be a prison term. Justice can be no charges were filed. Justice can be a neighborhood accountability court where, my office has a project now where we are shifting cases, appropriate cases, to a neighborhood accountability board to manage. I think you know about that.
I do.
And the whole idea is, can we restore both sides of the equation back, to where they were before crime happened? That's what we really ought to be focused on. And we should think about the criminal justice system has not done a good job at judging ourselves. Businesses, in order to turn a profit, have to analyze themselves. Do they sell a good product? Do they market it well? We don't do that. We don't do that. But it is time for us to take a look at the criminal justice system ourselves to see what have we done in the past that worked. Not all we do is bad. And what have we done that doesn't work? So it's time, to turn the page and step off into a new frontier and see how we can do better.
Thank you very much. All right, at this point, we will look at questions from the audience.
All right, can you guys hear me? Oh, that's good. So we have a question about, is there an effort being made, as in California, to reform the bail bond system? Well, I can speak for the courts. Yes, it is something that is being looked at. So, again, going back to those three branches of government, I teach constitutional law, so forgive me here for a second. But, I mean, there is a legislative branch, there's an executive branch, and there's a judicial branch. And so I know that the judiciary is looking at this issue quite a bit with this commission that I serve on. And one of the things that the commission does is we promulgate rules as to how to proceed in felony cases, in misdemeanor cases, in the municipal courts and the state courts. And so one of the things that I know that has been looked at by a task force that the Supreme Court has impaneled is, do we want to have a statewide pretrial services program? Do we still want to have bail and bond? Do we want to have bail and bond in all felony cases or certain felony cases? And so I know that those rules are being looked at as far as how the Supreme Court would want judges to look at cases that come across their desk that are felony cases. That being said, there's also statutes that would be what would regulate a lot of that as well, which is completely independent of the judicial branch. And so that's when you start to look at your elected officials and say, is this something we want? Is it something we don't want? And so that's a kind of a different conversation. The courts are often, we're limited by what the law is. We follow the law, we don't make the law. We can have procedures in place on how we apply certain laws so it's more universal from county to county, but those are, a lot of that is legislative, and it's being done in California, it's been done, is it Tennessee? I think it's being done, it's been done in a lot of different places, and it's all legislatively done, so I think it's something definitely worth looking at.
Anybody else have a thought?
I will weigh in on this as well. So I have studied this issue as it's kind of come across other jurisdictions across the United States. And we do use a cash bail system in most parts of this region, the metro-wide region. Some jurisdictions, like there's a particular jurisdiction in New Jersey that did away with a cash system altogether. And they went to a hearing system where they had to demonstrate, the prosecutor had to demonstrate danger to community or to self in order to incarcerate. And the numbers actually went up. The numbers of incarceration pretrial actually went up rather than went down. So I don't know if we think there's a particular outcome that you're looking at for that kind of system. I don't know that it necessarily exists. A lot depends on these individual jurisdictions and how they currently operate. I live and work in Jackson County. We have some serious issues with our detention center, serious. One of the serious issues that we have is amazing overcrowding. And that's because the jail has about 754 beds for the state level prosecutor to use. Of that 754 beds, some of these folks are probation violators, so judges issue warrants for certain probation violators to come back in and they get arrested and they may have to sit for a little bit to get their hearing. Some people are given an opportunity to come to court on their own, but they fail to come back to court as the judge has ordered them to do, and so a warrant is issued and they get a seat in the bed for, a seat in the jail for a little while. So I just want to tell you, out of that 754, the number drops down to about 550, beds for people awaiting trial in Jackson County. And now we're dealing with some tighter numbers because it takes about 2 years to get a case to trial. Violent crimes case, and a lot of people want someone accused of murder to stay put. Not everyone does in Jackson County, right? Not everybody does. A judge will evaluate a bond and in individual circumstances to see whether or not that person can live safely in the community during the course of the prosecution. We had about 500 bullet to skin shootings last year in Kansas City alone. That means where a bullet actually struck someone and the person did not die. That's just a murder that didn't quite happen. So, we run out of beds pretty darn quick. That leaves robberies with gun, other types of assaults, domestic violence. We like to have a lot of people want to see someone who's accused of domestic violence have at least some kind of cool down period in the jail. I don't know that these are great ideas. I'm just telling you this is how our system currently operates. And then people who are accused and charged with rape and child molestation, same theory. So y'all can do math, I'm sure better than me. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not real good at it, but we're out. We're out of beds. We're out of beds. So that's our reality. So the reality in Jackson County, should we move to a different bond system, may not work out the way it might in other jurisdictions when you have maybe a much more liberal use of jail space.
And can I just piggyback on kind of what Jean was saying? I do think that when you talk about criminal justice reform, I think she's absolutely right when you talk about there's victim crimes. There are horrific crimes that people have suffered and will suffer long-term effects from certain crimes. And I think that is a conversation and a huge piece of the conversation that we cannot ignore and that we should definitely take into consideration. I think a lot of the conversation regarding the criminalization of policy tends to focus on some of those lower level offenses, the driving offenses and misdemeanor municipal case court offenses and different offenses where maybe people are incarcerated because they couldn't pay, a $50 bond or a $100 bond, whereas the person committing the murders, they're in there with $250,000 or $500,000. That's a bit of a different conversation than when you're talking about the topic of criminalization of policy and criminalization of poverty. And I want to make sure that we just are realizing this is a multifaceted conversation. It's just not bail and bond or incarceration. Sometimes there's a hybrid system. I think these are the kind of things we have to start to look at. We should look at the individual offenses a lot of time, and that's what I think Ms. Jean was saying was the way it works in Jackson County is her office makes bond recommendations, and then the courts decide, is this something that we should put a bond on? Is this something where we should issue a summons to get them to come to court? And so there's a lot of discretion for the court. Every court in the state does not work that way. And it doesn't work that way across the nation either. And so I think oftentimes we have to kind of think about in these conversations, there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different practices that are going on across the country, and which is, great, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this. When you look at this from an academic standpoint, what works, what doesn't work, what has been tried, what has not worked, I think those are conversations worth having. As a federal prosecutor, there was no bond. Either you were in or you were out. That was it. There was you couldn't make bond and get out. And so it creates a whole different kind of system and a whole different dynamic than when you're talking about trying to make bond or figuring out how to make bond or not.
Thank you.
Can I add? So just zooming out a little bit to provide a bit of national context, and I just want to say I really appreciated your comment, Jalila, in distinguishing that it's not a one-size-fits-all type of approach. And you're absolutely right. When we're talking about the criminalization of poverty, in my experience, it really has been focusing on more of the lower level, more nonviolent type of offenses. But we're seeing that when we look at pretrial detention versus incarceration, there are far more people going through jails than prisons. So that's another important distinction to make, because oftentimes when we talk about detention, or we often use the words jail and prison interchangeably, those of us that are not working in the criminal justice system, but they're two very different things. And nationally speaking, the field of pretrial services, pretrial risk assessments, it's an old field. There's been a lot of research done, but it's also still kind of new, because we're still trying to figure out what's working and what's not working, and trying all these different approaches. But I think the bottom line is really that everything has to be context specific, and really customized to the local population and to even county by county. So I think that's the key. And in the research that I've done, that's what has been most effective. We have various different approaches that have been taken. In Washington, D.C., for example, they don't have bail bonds either, and the use of cash bail is almost non-existent there, and it's been that way for quite some time. And of course, the federal system, as you mentioned, it's the same, but there are, a lot of different approaches being taken, and it's a continually growing field.
Yes, another great question. Europe is coming up in a lot of these questions. So when you talk about Switzerland or the Netherlands, excuse me, and you talk about the decriminalization of drug use, why aren't we doing what Europe's doing?
Who would like to take that?
Okay, yes.
Well, we are moving that direction. So, look, drug courts are not a new concept. 25 years ago in Jackson County, a prosecutor named Claire McCaskill started a drug court. And it was, at that time, a pretty radical idea. Now everyone has a drug court. Everyone. Out of 114 counties in Missouri, I think 113 have a drug court, and the other county uses someone else's. So it works out, right? It works out. And that's because we have learned that treating addiction, maybe criminalization, doesn't really work, right? We tried it really hard. We worked really, really, really hard at this war on drugs, and we just didn't do it. It didn't work. And so I think we're moving that direction. Maybe for parts of America, it's too slow. But certainly Jackson County moved a step closer today.
I just wanted to kind of comment on a side note, like Judge Otto had explained about how there's a difference between different jurisdictions, local, state, and federal. For example, marijuana is a federal violation, so you can decriminalize it locally. However, you still have a violation on the federal side, so that kind of complicates matters. Kansas City, Missouri decriminalized in April of this past year, of last year, decriminalized possession of marijuana. However, that's the only place. And if someone, as everybody locally knows, you can cross over into state line and you're in Kansas, that's a whole new ballgame. Same deal with if you're in Platte County or Clay County, and now to Jackson County, different levels. And also there's all kinds of, with the drug charges, there's all kinds of ancillary charges that can go with it. So it's kind of hard, it's kind of going toward decriminalization, but it's kind of hard when you have so many different jurisdictions, and it's still a federal violation. So you have to deal with that. Who's ever in charge of the Justice Department determines whether they want to pursue possession of marijuana or whether they want to try to go ahead and go after people for it. Same thing with finances. In Colorado, you cannot, you go to a bank to pay for, so you can't write a check for possession, for marijuana or use a credit card. You have to use a cash business. So that opens up a whole nother can of worms as far as interstate commerce. So it's a little difficult to you're going to have to do it in baby steps to do decriminalization.
I'd also like to add, I'm wearing my public health hat now, that I think, touching on Jean's comment earlier about the criminal justice system being used as this catch-all for all of these different societal issues that we don't have the infrastructure yet to deal with appropriately. I think the drug issues are a prime example of that. And I really hope that moving forward we can see more collaboration and a societal kind of shift in how we think about drug abuse and drug crimes as more of a public health problem, and really collaborating with the healthcare system, with social workers, with public health professionals, and people working in the criminal justice system to come up with more holistic solutions that really get to the root of those problems.
And not touching necessarily on the drugs and criminalization, but kind of thinking about all the things that we're talking about up here, is the amount of behavior that has been criminalized over the year has gone up exponentially. When you look at the number of potential felonies that existed 40 years ago, they were a fraction of what is criminal behavior now. So you say it's, societal ills, whatever undesirable behavior we don't like, we can criminalize. Yep. You can either do it on the local side, the state side, or the federal side. But if we don't like it, we'll just say you can't do it, and then determine what communities and what neighborhoods that you're going to really kind of begin to enforce those laws in. And so I think the conversation about decriminalizing drugs, I think you have to recognize that we increase criminalization of all behaviors. So drugs is just one aspect of behavior, but I do think that's something that we do need to look at, and that's, again, a legislative issue, not for the court to do anything with, but if the legislation decides this behavior is undesirable, littering or panhandling or whatever it may be, then it becomes criminalized. And as Jean said, when the police come and encounter you doing these things, the only resource they have is to take people into jails. And as you said, the jails, think of it this way, there's jails and there's prison. When you're arrested, you go to jail until a court determines if you're guilty or not. And then once you're determined to be guilty and convicted of a crime, then if it's a felony, you go to a prison. So we're kind of talking about that window of jail. Prison and sentencing, that's a whole other aspect. Like I said, there's so many multiple layers of this, and we work in it so much. I know what you guys are talking about. I just want to make sure that you guys know what we're talking about is when you get arrested, you're going to jail. Now what happens to your case is going to be determined in a court later to determine possibly if you do go to prison, and then there's sentencing disparities and various studies that we can talk about if we need to talk about that as well.
Okay, thank you.
So there was a mention of collateral consequences for low-income people who get involved in the criminal justice system. What are these?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm so glad you asked. So basically, as I mentioned earlier during my introductory comments, once you have a criminal record, which can, at the minimum, be anything from having been arrested, charges dropped, never convicted, to something as on the other end of the spectrum as having spent multiple years in prison and having come out after that. There's a whole range of other situations in between and different levels of interaction with the criminal justice system. But just the mere fact of having a record entails many consequences. And in essence, that label of a criminal is applied from the moment that arrest occurs. And so we have a lot of stigma in our society. That's real. And there's a lot of fear and public safety concern. So because of that, this label of criminal is used to exclude people from fully participating in society after acquiring that label. And so we see these collateral consequences in primarily when people are trying to either after after being arrested, or at the other end of the spectrum, after re-entering society after having served time behind bars, we see numerous barriers in finding employment, pursuing higher education, in receiving public assistance, and in securing housing. These are kind of the four main areas. There are others as well. But employment in particular is a major one, because and specifically for low-income people, because if we are saying that low-income people are at higher risk of interaction with the criminal justice system, how are we expecting them to reduce that risk and get out of that cycle, which otherwise they are trapped in, if they're not able to then earn income and get out of that? And education is also closely tied to that, right? Because to progress, to increase your earning ability, you need to have access to higher education in this country. So, we see a lot of stigma with employers, doing background checks, asking for, even just on the application, having to check a box if you've ever been arrested or convicted. And so related to that, there's a movement called Ban the Box, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and are familiar with. And similar to the research on pretrial services and various approaches, the Ban the Box is far newer, but I think the jury is still out on that as to whether it is really working or not. So I can share kind of both sides of that debate briefly. So Ban the Box really means taking that box that you have to check, whether it's for job applications or for higher education when you're applying to college, taking that box off the application. So the intention is to allow people to get their foot in the door, get through that first step, so that at least they're not weeded out immediately. And then perhaps at the interview stage or when they're meeting with someone in person, they might have a chance to explain if appropriate. Otherwise, maybe it won't come up. And they can actually have access to a job or educational opportunity without having that barrier preventing them from accessing it. And so studies have been done. Again, it's a pretty new practice and policy. It's been adopted in a lot of different states and cities throughout the country. But some of the research is showing that because that bias and that stigma still exists, particularly against African American communities and Latino communities, who, these communities are disproportionately represented at higher rates within the criminal justice system. So because that stigma still exists in our society, some of the research is showing that people are using other proxies to basically not consider these applicants. So instead of, now that there's no box, they're using things like name and guessing a person's race by their name, or looking at their education level when they're applying for a job. And on the other side, there are studies showing that people have much greater access to jobs and education because of Ban the Box. So the jury's still out on that. I'll stop there.
Can I talk a little bit about collateral consequences? Because I'm glad you brought up that as well. And you're right. And I'll even give you some tangible things. If you're convicted of any drug offense anywhere, you cannot be eligible for, or you may not be eligible for federal financial aid if you did want to go to college. So even if you decided later in life you want to go to college, you had a marijuana offense, you may not be able to be eligible for federal financial aid. Public housing, you may lose your housing voucher, and you and your children may not have a place to stay. That's a collateral consequence. Food stamps, there's also ramifications for that. So when you start talking about collateral consequences, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of collateral consequences that vary from city to state to municipality. And most of these collateral consequences are administratively determined. They're not statutory, so they haven't been enacted by a legislation. They haven't been imposed by a judge, but it's just an administrative determination that a certain entity has decided. Because of this, you're no longer going to be eligible for this. And so the question becomes, with collateral consequences, should administrative bodies be able to have that much influence on long-term effects that affect people? And I think there's going to be a conversation about that as we go on, as people become more and more aware about collateral consequences. Do we want all of those ramifications? who is in the position to determine if you're going to have all these long-term consequences? Do they have the authority to do that? And because right now, any agency can decide they want them, and then they're there. And so that's just a conversation that'll keep going.
I never want to cut off the judge. So I think there's one other piece that I think we ought to at least mention, and that is the area of expungement. And expungement, believe it or not, it's been revised. Got a new life in Missouri a couple of years ago. And so on the Missouri side in Jackson County, the prosecutor's office is leading an expungement clinic effort with UMKC. And these cases all go before a judge, and a judge decides whether or not that's an appropriate case, and the prosecutor has to weigh in. And so we went ahead and decided to see if we could lead the charge on that. Kansas has a much, wait for it, more liberal law on expungement. Y'all allow all kinds of things to come off people's record. And I think this is something that we really have to consider, because I've been a prosecutor for a number of years now, over 20 years. And truly, this is going to maybe sound a little insulting, but 20 years ago, it really wasn't that big a deal to get a felony conviction. Maybe you got an SIS probation, you did your probation, you left the courthouse, you felt like, all was good. Little did you know that we'd become more punitive over time. That 20 years later, we'd be thinking about that conviction you got, for failing to pay your child support 20 years earlier. So expungement needs to be something that we really embrace and we take a look at, and we because we are evolving, and so the laws need to evolve with us and allow us the opportunity to take a look at collateral consequences as they impact people, and whether or not people have really turned the page. If they've turned the page, if they've stepped off in a new direction, why do we got to keep punishing them?
I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little more. Because of our clients that we represent, a lot of them are not necessarily large jail enhancements. So a lot of our clients will simply say, well, it's no big deal. I'll just plead to a resisting arrest, or I'll plead to a marijuana because it's not a jailable offense. And we try to explain to them the consequences of that. Again, it goes back to college scholarships. If they go to a different city, they can pick up a marijuana ticket in Westport, but then they end up over here on Metcalf, and they're at Sporting Kansas City, and they pick up a marijuana. Then it's an enhancement because now they've got a prior, even though before it was just a $25 fine or whatever. So, and then resisting arrest. In our city court, resisting arrest is a very broad offense. It can cover everything from giving a false name to moving your hands away when you're about to be cuffed, or flopping on the ground and not letting the officer handcuff you or talk to you. So it's very broad, and we always tell, especially our young defendants, that you plead to this even though the penalty is, there's an easy probation or something that you could do. A resisting arrest can stay with you even though it just shows resisting. So for example, if you plead guilty to a resisting arrest and you happen to be in a car with a friend who was speeding, he gets pulled over, the police officer asks for your name, they look your record up, you have a resisting. So now the officer is a little worried, he's concerned, this is a guy that could be a threat to him naturally. So he's going to call backup, so you're going to be delayed longer, you're going to be searched more. I mean, these are things that people don't realize the consequences until it actually happens to them again. So we try to explain to them, you have to understand that this is not just no big deal, something like a resisting or a marijuana or a minor in possession in Kansas, which you have to put on your college scholarship application that you were charged with. Granted, it's only beer, and you were charged with having a beer when you were under the age of 21, and something like that can have a long-term effect on people until it's too late. And then by then you're ready to do the expungement, but then that takes time. So those are the collateral consequences on a daily basis that people have.
Well, we have some great fact checks that we wanted to share.
I'll use hers, it's easier. The question came up about European countries and decriminalization, and it has proven to be favorable, good results. But the Cato Institute looked at Portugal's decriminalization, and found it was particularly successful with the preteen and teenagers and even up to 24-year-olds. So it looks like tolerant laws coupled with honest education is proving to be the way to go. And the Netherlands have been at this for quite a while, and they also have very favorable results. So.
All right, we have talked about the problems primarily. Let's talk about some of the solutions and ideas that might be recommended. Lavanya, from your work, give us a few things that might be done to reduce the criminalization of poverty.
Sure. So I will start with the increased interaction with the criminal justice system that particularly low-income communities and communities of color are facing. I think racial profiling is a very real thing, and perhaps some of my other panelists here could share the local context since I'm not from this area. But I think that when you think about the broader racial context of this country and our history, we've all been socialized in different ways, and we all have different levels of bias. And so I think that addressing that with our law enforcement officials is the utmost priority. Because if we can really start at the beginning of this cycle and prevent or at least reduce the number of people that are having interactions with the criminal justice system due to bias, I think that that can really help address all of the issues that we're facing further down the line. So I think that would probably be number one on my list. In addition to that, just I'm not going to get into too many specifics as much, but just thinking about ways that, you know, as we as individuals can examine our own biases, like things like taking the Harvard implicit bias test. I did that recently. It was very eye-opening. I think it starts with each and every one of us taking that personal commitment to confront our own biases and take that journey, because we are all part of this society. And the root cause of most of these problems that we're all talking about is, you know, that there are racist and classist tendencies that have become embedded in the very fabric of America. So I think that's also very important. And then really getting politically and civically engaged, working with our elected officials, and working with people within the criminal justice system to really analyze the policies and practices that do exist, and pushing for change. Yeah.
Oh, well, okay, go down. Oh, sure. I was going to talk about, as Ms. Peters Baker talked about, having a drug court. Our court also has a drug court, but we also have a mental health court and a veterans court. You know, I don't want to get too much into the nuances of each court. However, mental health is a big issue. And if you have a court where you can have a defendant who is diagnosed with PTSD or bipolar or depression or something like that, where they could be allowed to go to this court and have their issues addressed. Because our court, the penalties aren't that steep. So what happens is, I mean, I can represent a guy who's been trespassing at a bus stop 10 or 12 times in a course of 3 or 4 years. And each time he gets arrested, they just take him to jail, and then the next day he's in court. And if we had a mental health court where they could address that issue as to why this guy keeps going back to the same bus stop, or why does this person keep stealing from this particular Walmart, or why someone is constantly wanting to go out and smoke crack all the time. And if you can address that rather than arrest them for trespassing and possession of a pipe, that would free up police services. That would also free up jail space, essentially, because once someone gets taken to the jail, it's a long process to process a person out, for the police officer to fill a report out, and then they appear in court the next day or day after. And so by having these specialty courts could alleviate a lot of these issues. Same thing with having a crisis intervention center. If you had a center that was open 24 hours. So if someone's calling saying someone's suicidal and they call the police because they don't know who to call, the police arrive rather than, arrest the guy for being disorderly or trying to escape in a car or something like that. They could take him to this crisis intervention center and maybe they can address the issue, and then the police can go back on the street. They're not necessarily having to process someone out at the jail and going through this process and then involving the courts the next day or 2 days later and dealing with all the other issues that come with that. So if courts were allowed to expand those particular programs, obviously it's going to take a lot of funding, but it would alleviate on the back end what would happen.
And I agree with what both of the two panelists said. Becoming engaged civically and having your voice heard about things like this. We have these wonderful dialogues and we go home and we tell our spouse about them and we go to bed and then tomorrow we get up and go about our business. But sometimes coming to these kinds of events should be a starter to get you civically engaged, to get your voice out there, to be heard, encourage others to be heard. I mean, that is kind of the framework of our democracy is these collaborative voices can get things done. And so I would encourage everyone when you leave here that you don't leave this conversation in this room. I think what Wayne is saying is important is resources, using your voices to encourage the development of resources for people who need aid. As a judge, there's a lot of people who come in front of me who mental health is paramount. Some mental health treatment, crisis intervention treatment would be extremely beneficial. Simply giving them, taking the medication that they have in their house, just doing these things, but there's no resources for that. When I first started prosecuting, there were a lot more resources. The Department of Mental Health would come and pick people up from court, take them to a facility and get them medicated and get them stable. There's no money for those types of things anymore. I know there's always a dialogue about this is a mental health issue. Well, I think we need to kind of figure out civically how we begin to use our resources to assist that segment of the population. I know that would benefit the courts because, in fact, when somebody's in front of me and it's coming in front of me as a criminal activity, my hands are tied as the court, and the prosecutor's hands are tied as to what remedy they can ask for. So use your civic engagement to say, what kind of resources do we really want in our community to serve our citizens? I do want to touch upon your question about the racial profiling. I think it was maybe, help me out, Jean, was it 16, 17 years ago when the legislature passed that they were going to begin to collect highway patrol data of traffic stops in the state of Missouri? I think it was about 16 years ago. And every year they produce a report. You can go to the Attorney General's website of the state of Missouri and look at the report and read it and see what the numbers are. It's public knowledge, it's public information. I think the last one I maybe looked at was maybe 2016. And in it, the authors had a little introduction that says, we've been writing these reports for 16 years. Is anybody going to do anything with this information? And if so, what? And that's what I'm talking about. Civically engagement is you guys read the reports, ask that something be done. And when you read the reports, it says that the stops, there is a higher percentage of stops of African American and Latinos. However, for actual finding of contraband and arrest, the demographic tended to be Caucasians. And so there was it didn't match up. It was somewhat disparate. The information's out there, but if no one is synthesizing it and asking that things be done with the information, then it's just another report on a shelf. And so civic engagement is reading, asking questions, having conversations, getting up in the morning, saying, I want to know this, and finding out, and I want to talk to my friends about it. And again, that's that democratic process that you can take a stand. We may not all agree on how to do it, and I think that's probably something we should say. We may have different approaches on how to do it, but I think we all can agree that something should be done.
I've got one more piece to add to that, and let me try and do it real quick, because I see some glazing. Victims, again, I don't want to forget victims. So last year, Kansas City had 150 homicides. Those are real people. Not so many of those cases actually get solved and the case gets brought to me for prosecution. So here's the point. A lot of those people are left with nothing No one goes to them. No one knocks on their door. Nobody wraps arms around them and says, how may I help you? I grew up in a small community where I make a joke regularly about this tuna casserole would show up at our house. When anything great happened, or so there was a celebration, or there was something horrible that happened, you'd get this tuna casserole, and it's we ate it. But it was what was behind, it was the gift of giving that tuna casserole. And I think we need to learn how to do that here. We are not too big of a metro region that we cannot look out for one another. And so when individuals are harmed by someone else's gunfire, when a family has a horrible event that happens to them, this community should not allow them to fend for themselves. So their trauma should be addressed, but they should also be helped by all of us. And I really, this part makes me really, really angry because so many victims get nothing. And we can change that. We can change that.
Dalila, you served on a commission in Jefferson City, and were there some recommendations that came out of that? Did you like to share, or is it similar to what you already mentioned?
Well, that's the commission I was talking about, the racial and ethnic fairness. And so I think it's an ongoing commission, and I think they're one of the biggest ones that came at it was the creation of a joint task force on pretrial and bail and bond reform to look at those issues. But I know that they are looking at what the courts can do, what rules we can promulgate for procedural fairness. And so, but a lot of it's going to look at legislation that's going to come down the pipe as well.
Okay, thanks. All right, we are to the point of, we're going to ask the so what, now what question. And so if you would give us your so what, now what response.
Sure. So my so what, which is a brief summary of what my perspective has been today, is basically that we have policies that are disproportionately affecting and preventing the full participation of people who have low incomes and people of color. And it's absolutely urgent that we change that. And my now what is everyone in this room has an important role to play in changing that. We all have a voice, we all make decisions every day, and it's really up to us to become informed, seek out information, to question our biases, to question our assumptions, and to really think critically and hold ourselves as well as our elected officials and people working in government accountable and working with them to create more effective solutions that embrace diversity and that embrace the diverse experiences that we have as a society.
Elected officials presently excluded on this, but municipalities, as far as municipal courts are concerned, have to understand that municipal courts aren't fundraising entities. They're not means to raise funds for the city. They are a vital function, as some city council members had talked about recently in Kansas City. Municipal courts are functions just like parks and recs and snow removal. It's going to cost money, and to properly do a municipal court where you want to have expansion for drug court, you want to have expansion for veterans court and mental health court, and then that'll free up police time, that'll free up court time, and it's just going to cost money, but you can't use municipal courts as money-making machines to generate income if taxes are low or something like that. As far as to address that, that's something the public, because the elected officials like to have bigger jails, but they're not a problem with that, but they don't like to spend money on having probation officers or having municipal courts or having, so it has to be a situation where the public has to tell these elected officials that it's important to have a municipal court. It's also important in the sense that, because you never know, you may be a witness to a crime that's a low-level crime that appears in municipal court, and you could be stuck there for 4 hours, 5 hours, because of the crowded and the overcrowded, and also handling everything from parking tickets to serious domestic violence or child abuse cases. So it could be a long day for the public to be there, and until it actually affects you, you wouldn't know that. So by telling your elected officials to fund municipal courts better and then not use it just like you do for parks and recs or snow removal.
So the so what is, this is a multifaceted, multi-level issue. It's not anything you can encapsulate with the dialogue we're just having here now, today. I think that's what you need to kind of think about. And then the now what is, think bold, bring forth new ideas. Everything started as an idea, and someone had enough gumption to try it out and see if it works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But think big. It's not a problem that this didn't come up overnight. It won't be solved overnight. But I do think that everyone's opinion it should be valued and should be heard as we go through this.
So I think the so what is, it's a very exciting time to be part of the criminal justice system, because we're embarking on change. Again, maybe that change comes a bit too slow for some, but it's happening. I can tell you I'm part of groups where we study changes of other cities around the country, and I watch what other prosecuting attorneys' offices are doing, and I try and leave the bad ideas and bring home some good ones. So there is a lot ahead for us, and I think the criminal justice system only stands to improve as time goes on. I think we'll look quite different in 20 years than we look today, just like when I started. It's a very different looking system. And we are far more introspective than we once were, in the criminal justice system. So I think there is good change ahead. I think that there's an opportunity, though, for everybody in this room. And if you really want to make a difference later this week or next week, you could sign up to be a mentor in the Kansas City, Missouri public school system, or I'm sure KCK has something similar. You should pick a community that needs your help. And some of you perhaps need some of the experiences that you have to offer, and maybe the time that you could potentially have to offer. But if you wanted to make real impact, you could do that even next week. That could happen. And you could make a huge change on someone's life simply by showing up, regularly showing up, and showing that you give a damn about them.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you for listening.